Welcome to Study Loop.
Hi everyone. Today we're starting chapter 34 with question 1, where we're being asked to explain how each of the following developments would affect the supply of money, the demand for money, and the interest rate. And we should illustrate our answers with diagrams. Alright, so first of all, we need to determine what is the right kind of diagram we're going to be using. Since all our questions deal with the money market, it makes sense to use a simple supply and demand graph for the money market. Namely, on the x-axis we have the quantity of money M, on the y-axis we have the interest rate R. The money supply curve will always be vertical because it's fixed by the central bank exogenously, and the money demand curve will be downward sloping. Now, just a quick reminder, why is the money demand curve downward sloping? According to the theory of liquidity preference that we learned in chapter 34, the interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding money. That is, when you hold wealth as cash in your wallet instead of as an interest bearing bond, you'd lose the interest you could have earned. And as a result, an increase in the interest rate raises the cost of holding money and consequently reduces the quantity of money demanded, and vice versa. So we see there is a negative relation between the interest rate and money holdings, and hence the curve will be downward sloping. All right, so part one asks, what happens when the Fed's bond traders buy bonds in open market operations? Well, this is not a very difficult question because we know that when the Fed's bond traders buy bonds, they increase the supply of money in the economy. So the money supply curve will move from MS1 to MS2. There's a shift to the right. And since this dissects the downward sloping money demand curve at a lower point, our equilibrium interest rate will be lower. We move from R1, R2. And of course, this makes sense since the buying of bonds in open market operations injects money into the economy, money becomes more abundant, and hence the interest they're going to be bearing must be lower. Okay, part B asks, what happens when an increase in credit card availability reduces the amount of cash people want to hold? This is even more straightforward because we've been given that people want to hold less money. So, what does this mean? That the demand for money decreases. So, the money demand curve will shift to the left. MD1 goes to MD2. And hence, once again, the equilibrium interest rate is going to drop from R1 to R2. Part C says what happens when the Federal Reserve reduces banks' reserve requirements. Okay, well, let's think about it for a second. One of the many tools of the Fed is changing or setting the target for the minimum banks reserve requirements. So if the Fed says that now the banks need to have 10% instead of 20% in reserve requirements, what are the banks going to do? They're going to be able to lend more money uh, through loans, and this will definitely increase the money supply. So the money supply curve shifts from MS1, MS2, and once again, the equilibrium interest rate reduces to R2. This is very similar to our first case, part A. All right. Part 4 says households decide to hold more money to use for holiday shopping. Once again, here it is. The answer is very straightforward because we've been given that households want to hold more money. So we know that the money demand curve will shift to the right from MD1 to MD2. And since money becomes more wanted in this economy, think about it as a more scarce commodity, the interest rate will have to increase from R1, R2. Finally, we're being asked to determine what happens when a wave of optimism boosts business investment and expands aggregate demand. Once again, similar to part D, what's happening here is that business become very optimistic about the future. They want to invest more, they might want to take more loans, and this will increase the demand for money. since aggregate demand expands. So the money demand curve will shift from MD1 to MD2, and once again, since money become a more scarce commodity, more wanted commodity in the economy, the interest rate will rise from R1 to R2.